Hello and welcome back to the channel. As always, I'm Morgan. Once again, I am in need of giving y'all an apology. I apologize for another lapse in videos. Life is weird right now, and 2020 is the year that just says F everybody in particular, which is fantastic. But without further ado, I have in my last couple of videos had a lovely background, possibly from the quacking little nightmares that have taken over my bathroom. Well, in the last couple of weeks, those fluffy little ducklings have gotten a lovely enclosure built for them and moved on into their more permanent outside enclosure, only coming in to once again take over my bathroom at nighttime. So let's talk about the ducks and their enclosure. A little bit of background before I move into the actual enclosure build portion of this video, which is going to be hopefully the main content here. Let's talk about why I have ducklings all of a sudden, since that wasn't exactly how I thought my 2020 and my summer was going to go. Honestly, things were supposed to be fairly straightforward this summer. I have my internship that just started today as of filming, and I would have been working with a horse and doing all that fun stuff, which will be touched on at some point in the future. But there is a blog post up if you are interested in hearing my horsey adventures. Click on the link to my website down below, and there is a complete recap of the first month of owning Padme and her training. But back to the duck situation. So after about 3 or 4 days of owning Padme and working with her every morning, I was getting ready to head back home after a fairly regular training session, working on picking up her feet, easy stuff like that, when I got a call from my mother, sounding a little panicked, asking when I would be home, which was weird since I get home about the same time every day from working with the horse in the morning. So I told her, well, I'm about to leave right now. I'm just talking to Grandpa for a little bit, since that is where my horse is kept, at my grandparents' a few minutes away. Before you freak out, everything is socially distanced. Everyone is quarantining. So we don't really leave either of our respective houses very much. It is very hygienic and safe. But that's not the point here. My mother had called me, panicked, asking when I would be home, which was weird. I assumed something was wrong with one of the dogs or someone had gotten hurt. We had recently been removing an old box that the previous owner of my house had installed near the pool, and I knew that there were possibly some rusty nails and screws still around, so I was worried that one of the dogs may have gotten one of those through their paws or something equally as terrible. But the next thing she said to me was probably the most bizarre thing my mother has ever said to me was, "There is a duckling in the backyard and I don't know what to do." And to say I was blindsided by that statement is really not the correct way to put it, but that's the only way I have to put it, because of all the possible terrible scenarios running through my brain, since my immediate instinct was to panic, that was none of them. So in our community, there is a duck pond about a quarter of a mile away from my house. I asked if she could see mama duck and other babies anywhere, because if so, just leave it alone. Mama duck will get it. It'll be fine. She said no, it was just the one duckling. I'm like, okay, well, I'll be home in about 20 minutes, depending on traffic. We'll come and deal with this, keep the dogs inside. It had gotten into our pool. But at this time, it was still fairly cool. I was worried about it being too cold and possibly starting to sink a little, so I told her, keep an eye on it. If it starts to sink, grab the pool net, prop it up. So I get home with my partner, and yes, there is a duckling in my pool. And yes, the duckling does appear to be alone. So we're like, okay, let's get it out of the pool. Let's get it into one of the cat carriers for now. So after wrestling through this situation and catching that little thing and getting it safely inside a cat carrier and putting it in my bathroom, we're just like, okay, well, we're gonna have to go for a walk. We're gonna have to search for ducklings. So my partner and I put on our walking shoes and started searching around my neighborhood, took a nice walk down to the duck pond, which I didn't honestly think it could have come from there. One, because of how far away my house really is. It was unlikely since the duck pond in my community is basically a duck haven. But also, we have a homeowners association that does pay for the upkeep of these amenities in our community. And one of the things that the landscapers always do, I think they remove eggs so they don't get ducklings, because our HOA keeps a very specific number of ducks at the pond, and I've never seen ducklings there. And I've been living here for a few years, and I like to go walk at that pond a lot. So unsurprisingly, we walk down there, we see nothing. Over the next couple of days, I had searched the bushes around my house to see if I could find a nest, possibly. Nothing. And based on my research I did, because I am not a bird expert, I was not really intending to enter the world of bird ownership anytime soon. I determined this duckling was probably about 2 weeks old. It was starting to get those little prickles of real feathers coming in, but the thing that I knew for sure was this was very unlikely to be a wild duckling based on how confident this little guy was around people. I think that he likely came from a household, an impulse buy for a kid, and he possibly nipped. Kid didn't want it anymore, possibly just dumped in my neighborhood. Luckily for that duck, he ended up in my backyard. So once we finally accepted the fact that we have a little duck now named Winston, our next step was, well, if we're going to have a backyard duck, this duck cannot be alone. It's bad for their mental health and overall well-being. They are social creatures. So we started calling the feed stores around to find out when they would be getting ducklings in so that we could go get little Winston some friends. And it took about a week, but eventually the Cahoots near me is a Cahoots feed and pet, so it is a feed store. They got their shipment in of their poultry, so they had a very limited number of ducklings. Well, I went over there and I picked up some ducklings. So now we have 3 ducks ranging from, at the time of recording, about 5 to 7 weeks old, because the ducklings that I picked up were within a couple days old at that point. So we have Norman and George, the 2 Swedish black ducks that may be crossbreeds. I'm not sure. Right now, we don't even know for sure what their gender is. We're still waiting for their baby fuzz to be gone and to see if their tails curl at all. Winston is for sure a female. We're not sure if she's a domestic bred mallard or if she's a production line Rouen, but it really doesn't matter. She is Winston, she is lovely, and Norman and George are Norman and George, and they are lovely. And they are my little quacking overlords that yell at me when my alarm goes off in the morning because they're ready to go out into this lovely enclosure that we just built. So, mentioning that lovely outdoor enclosure, let's talk about that, and let's talk about how it came to be now. So, first thing, I will preface this, there will be a post with photos on my website, linked down below, as well as complete blueprints on my Patreon if you are a patron, with a little bit more in detail about how we created this enclosure. That being said, it is a fairly simple design, and I am more than happy to answer any questions down in the comments if you have them. So basically, I had a very limited space to work with as far as where I could put an enclosure for them. And I also had a very limited amount of time in which I would have to build it before they got too large to live in my bathroom. And we had quite a few temporary enclosures set up in the bathroom because I didn't want to put a 2-week-old duckling in with my day-old ducklings, and I didn't want to put them together till they were roughly the same size. So for the safety of the little ones and the well-being of the big one who had hurt her little foot and was still limping a bit while she got better, they were separated. But the enclosure was fairly simple. Basically, it's a rectangle designed to fit in the space I had available. And the space I had available was this dirt patch that had been kind of, when I moved into this house, the only thing over it was some mulch because the previous owner started some projects but then never really did much with them. This house is super fun because I keep finding half-assed DIY projects, and I think that that dirt patch was one of them. And my original plan for this patch of dirt was to turn it into a bee and butterfly pollinator garden. Most of that duck patch is most of that dirt patch is a duck pen. And this strip of dirt is about 20 feet long and in theory is supposed to be about 6 feet wide, but because my neighbor's fence leans, it's not 6 feet wide everywhere, and that became an issue a little bit later in the build that I will mention again. But the enclosure itself is 10 by 5 feet. In theory, that should give me about 5 feet on either side for the door and for flower planting, and then 1 foot between my neighbor's fence and the back of this enclosure if it is up along the concrete. That didn't exactly go to plan, because when we had finally constructed the main part of the base and the upright poles and moved it into position, that's when we found out how crappy my neighbor's fence that he yells at me about when my dog gets too close to it all the time really and truly is. He seems to have put too many rocks against it, and so now it's leaning so that the bottom is pushing into my yard. So we had to improvise a little bit and slide the enclosure all the way to one side to get it to fit completely onto the dirt without needing to tear it apart and change any measurements. So we put this thing together, and over many hours, lots of cussing, a lot of drilling and screwing, no pun intended. Finally, we had this rectangle constructed with the pieces of 2x4 and 4x4. And once we did that, we were able to get the chicken wire and begin to staple it into place. And upon beginning the stapling, both of the staple guns we had were jammed and did not work. So cue a lot of cussing on our part and a bunch of frustration. What really happened here, what ended up needing to happen, was my partner went back to the hardware store for about the 8th time at that point. Because, things never go as planned. You find out you have the wrong thing, you need something else. Or, I don't know, you find out that you were provided with the wrong size staples for the staple gun, and that's why it's jammed. So your options are either nail everything by hand or go get a new staple gun. We opted for go get a new staple gun. And so we got the wire starting to be put into place. I did tack some of it with nails at certain points so it had a little bit more security, and we got the wire and all that loveliness done for the most part on day 1. So day 2, we just had to complete the wire, wire over the top so that nothing can get in and hurt the babies, and wire the door and then hang the door. Which, sounds pretty simple, should have only taken like 4 hours max. Well, it didn't. Because, it's 2020 and nothing's gonna go as planned in 2020. Basically, the wiring was fairly simple. The wiring went as planned now that we had the staple gun that worked, and our hands and arms were so numb from being cut over and over by chicken wire that it really didn't matter if we started bleeding again anyway. But then it came time to hang the door, which in theory should have fit the space absolutely perfectly. And I mean, the door is absolutely beautiful. My partner and his father made it and made it look very nice, made it very secure, and I'm very thankful for that. But when we went to hang it, the gap for the latch we had purchased was too large because the hinges were pulling the door way too much to one side, which was very, very freaking frustrating. But in retrospect, there could have been worse problems. Cue worse problems. So we had to take everything off. My partner had called his father for some advice. We were already headed to the hardware store to try to buy a different latch that would maybe be longer than the basic gate latch we had. Turns out it wasn't, spoiler alert. But we bought a third hinge because we had a gate hinge set that only came with 2 heavy-duty hinges and then the latch, which in theory should have been fine if 2020 were not the year that we're in. And that is what I'm deciding to blame all the problems with this project on. So we pick up the third hinge, I get another latch, whatever. We're like, okay, this will be fine. It was not fine. So it turns out we had to take the first 2 hinges off, which were the self-closing hinges, which is lovely, like those hinges are fine, but we had already kind of tightened things up so that it would be perfect. Turns out those self-closing hinges, they don't actually untighten very easily, and no matter what we did, it only tightened them more because the package lies. So after some more cussing and some more blood, sweat, and tears, not necessarily in that order, my partner went back and purchased 2 more hinges because we basically had 2 hinges that were not going to work out at this point. But finally, we get the door mounted on those hinges. But we still had to solve the problem of the latches not spanning the gap properly. So we had to take the other 2x4 that we had purchased to add an extra support in the top there to make a sort of DIY barn door hinge, which did end up working out very well. Now, because of the ground that the enclosure is placed on and the fact that most of the wood that was used is basically recycled from other projects and was just going to be thrown away, so we gave it new life, nothing really sits perfectly flat or perfectly straight. The thing does lean a little bit to the right and the whole door does kind of lean down. So the hinge isn't perfectly level at all, which is fine. The door and the latch, they serve their purpose. They keep the door closed. They keep the ducks safe during the day. And that, in the end, that's really what matters at the moment. So then once we had everything in place, everything finally done, had the tarp up to create shade, which eventually will be removed once I have a duck-safe vining plant growing up over the side closest to their pond to create shade that way. All that was left was to put in the rest of the soil I had purchased, the lovely kiddie pool that my partner's mother was nice enough to give us to use for the ducks, and add a couple of bricks and rocks around to help them get in and out of their pool. Specifically, the soil I used was just like an organic topsoil because it was going to be the safest option that I had available for me to use for the ducks. Originally, I wanted like a more fine mulch, but in my local area, the only mulches I could find were the dyed and color enhanced ones, which I was not putting in with my little sweet quacking overlord babies. So I use the same brand of soil that I pretty much use for everything because it's pesticide and fertilizer free, and it's essentially just glorified manure mixed with little mulch bits. And we filled up that bottom for them, made it nice and lovely so they weren't walking on the old hard dirt ground that had been there prior, filled up their pool, and released the beasts into their new outside enclosure. And this was also the first day that these 3 ducks were meeting without a wire between them. About a week prior, they had been living in a situation in which they were constantly able to interact between a wire. So it was a little anxiety inducing for me because I didn't know if they were actually going to get along, because it's one thing to have a wire between them and another thing for them to actually be able to interact more fully. Well, everything went fine. After a little bit of testing boundaries and pecking order establishing, they were fine. They were getting in and out of their pool, and now they are a happy little flock of 3, and their enclosure came out very nice. So if you guys want any more information on the enclosure, the experience, the ducks themselves, please do click the link down below to my post on my website about all of that and the profiles on all 3 of my little ducks, and for more updates as they grow and develop throughout their lives. Also, if you would like the blueprints and more in-depth instructions on how we put the enclosure together, if you too would like a fancy rectangle in your backyard for poultry of various kinds, please do click the link down to my Patreon, and that is available for my lovely patrons. Until next time, I hope you have a wonderful morning, day, evening, night, what have you, and I will see you all in the next one. Thank you again for watching this video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and ring that bell if you would like to see more. And if you'd like to follow me on any of my other social medias, the links are down in the description below. Don't forget to check out thereptilegoth.com for all of my articles and blog posts. If you found any value in this video and you would like to help support the channel, please check out my Patreon page. That link is also in the description down below. And a special thanks goes out to my Diamond Dragon patron, Diane V. What you're doing is really helping me fund a dream here. I will see you guys all in the next one.